So our readings this morning have that kind of, uncomfortable feel about them. If you do this, are you worse than them or are you better than them? That whole kind of judgmental stance where we place ourselves above another, whoever that other is, simply because we can. Because we make a judgment that somehow we are better, we are more righteous, we are more worthy, or more, just more. Jesus says no. No. If you do this, you're as bad as them. All of those ones you dislike, all of those ones you lord it over, all of those ones. Paul talks about it in the Corinthians. He talks about these things that occurred throughout the whole of the Old Testament. They did this and this happened. Did you think it was worse? They did this happened. Did you think it was worse? Christ is the righteousness. Christ is the strength. Christ's love is what calls us into being. And during Lent, love, Christ's love, is our Lenten calling, and it calls us into being. Now, you might have noticed that over the years, 7 years since I've been here, that we have Love Will Be Our Lenten Calling almost every week during Lent. I'm not trying to manipulate you into liking a song that I like because I like it. But Love Will Be Our Lenten Calling is the prayer that undergirds the gospel of love, that undergirds that truth of peace and learning and love that Christ wants us to understand. When I was young, I struggled to understand how something could be right with the world but wrong with God, as the world told me. The world told me that the problems in the world were God's fault because God didn't reach down and fix them. Over the years, I struggled with right and wrong. What's right? And who decides if it's right? Especially right and wrong within my own particular journey. Not only the process of becoming the priest or the pastor here, but even through the process of living day to day, week to week, year to year. I've worried about the way I do things, or even the way that I decide about things. Some of the things I'm concerned with don't seem to be important to anyone else. And some of the things that are important to everyone else don't seem to be that important to me. I worry about the decisions I come to and how I reconcile my inner core beliefs with the world stuff out there that bothers me or scares me. Surprisingly, I've come to the conclusion that Jesus is right. I know, right? Insert laugh here. Jesus is right. Scripture says you cannot add a single hour to your life by worrying about what you do or how you do it or whatever. And it's true. And I know it's true in my heart, true to my core. I know it's true. But I can't stop worrying because it's part of our human nature. It's like saying stop breathing and keep living. It's impossible for most of us. Some of the time, we make it. But most of the time, not. So rather than worry about that which I cannot change, i.e., the past, my personal history, all the things I've done wrong, all the bad decisions I've made, it occurred to me that love is actually my reason for existence. Like, it's so basic. It's so simple and complicated. Love is our calling, my calling. The reason the song resonates so deeply. It's a prayer. It's that yearning, that deep yearning. Today is Ida's baptism. I know I have to drag her in so she stays attentive. Today's Ida's baptism. And as I've reflected this week on what our readings are telling us, what the song is telling us, what our liturgy tells us, and also what Ida's baptism means for her and for us, and our Lenten discipline, that whole balance that we keep. In relation to God's love, the hymn is perfect. The hymn is absolutely perfect. It's a great place to start. So I've kind of abridged it down to one slide. Olivia, if you want to just pop it over to the next slide. See, love will be our Lenten calling, peace will be our Lenten living, and truth will be our Lenten learning. Calling, living, learning. Isn't that what we do from the second we're born? Love, peace, and truth. They're those core focuses within our hearts. I wonder if you were just to see this text, even though we've just sung the hymn, would your brain automatically fill it in with the music that sits behind it? In the case of the hymn, it's a bit of a both and. Musicians and singers argue about whether the words carry the tune or the tune carries the words. Music can move you, and it never has to have a word included. And words, poetry, can move you like it's sung, even if it's not, even if you never say it. It occurred to me that the hymn combines almost the best of all of those things. Music, lyricism, poetry, that way that we remember and have that deep-seated truth sitting within us. They're written from a place of deep truth and deep yearning, and they're written as a prayer. And sometimes, have you ever wondered why that particular hymn was put to that particular music? Did you ever wonder, did they write the music first or did they write the poem first and then try and fit the music around it? Often, very often, particularly in church, the two just mesh and resonate together. You know that we sing lots of hymns with new contemporary words, but to old music. Like old music. Some of it is so old it's been in the public domain forever. The writers of that music have been dead for centuries. And yet, it resonates because of the way the music touches us. This is God's love. God's love works on the same visceral level as music. It touches every part of us. It engages our intellect, our emotion, our spirit. Ida comes from a family of music. It's like, I think it's ingrained in her blood from her parents, who are both musicians, and for whom music is the language they use to communicate. The language they use to teach her. It's no wonder that when I asked her who God was, she said, it's like I can feel God. It's like I can feel Jesus. It's not like you can feel Jesus. You can. When something touches us deeply, it becomes ingrained. It becomes part of us. And hymns resonate that truth, that love will be our Lenten calling. That love, translated to Jesus, to God, to the gospel, to peace, to truth, is our calling, not just at Lent, but Lent's a good time to play the hymn. We've become so accustomed to that stuff we do in church. We sing this, we say that, this happens next, that happens next, it runs in this order, that we forget how beautiful and poignant and powerful it is. How it comes into being with us. It's like the fig tree. The fig tree, our fig tree in our garden. It's a huge tree. Anyone who's seen a full-grown, matured fig tree knows it is ginormous. And if you haven't seen one, look across the road. There's one over there. They are enormous trees. But if you had it in your yard and you walked past it or drove past it every day for years and years and years, you wouldn't even see it anymore. You might value its shade, but you wouldn't see it anymore. It just becomes part of where you live, what you do. Who's ever stood and looked at that tree across the road and marvelled at its enormous size? The fact that it's been here for 160 years. Starts off tiny, ginormous. The gardener in the gospel story says, wait, don't chop it down, hang on a second. You've just let it sit there and ignored it for 3 years. No wonder it hasn't given you any fruit. How about we think about it for a while? We water it, we tend it, we dig around the roots, we give it some water. We actually pay attention to it. Then it will bear fruit. And our lives are the same. Well, we just kind of run through the motions day after day, week after week. Life becomes a bit blur. That's a technical theological term, blur. We are called to more. We are called to recognize that fig tree of love, that enormous gift of love that sits in our hearts. And every so often it needs a bit of water. It needs a bit of grace. Sometimes it needs you to chuck a shovel and dig some of the rubbish out. And sometimes you need to pour manure on it and give it some love. And it'll give you back. If you spend 1 month on your fig tree, you'll get 1,000 pieces of fruit. That equates for me as grace. Abundant grace. More figs than you could ever eat. You would be so sick of figs you would never eat another one. Come on. But love, if you can give that little bit and get so much back. So we're going to baptise Ida in a minute. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about our conversation that we had. She's a very forthright child. She tells you what she thinks, which is good. Unabashed with her answers, not ashamed at all. You know, like if I was to say to one of you, who's Jesus for you? You know, how do you know Jesus is? You'd be like, oh, what does she want to know? Does she want a theological answer? Does she want me to pretend I know what I'm talking about? Does she want me to prove I've been reading the Bible? No, Ida didn't think that. She goes, oh, it's a bit like sushi after school, or a bedtime story. Or actually, and I said, oh, so it's like, you know, being with your family and stuff. She goes, yes. It's like, you know, that warm, fuzzy feeling you get when you get a hug. It's like, I do. Isn't that true? Isn't it truth? Isn't it real? When I asked her to talk about Jesus, she said Jesus is like that, like sushi after school, a bedtime story, a jumper on a cold day to block out the wind. I think they're great answers. And they tell more about us than they do about her. And they tell more about how we engage with God on a ephemeral level, superficial, kind of surface, and how we are called in Lent and any other time into a deeper, more visceral relationship with God. So next time you sing, Love Will Be Our Lenten Calling, remember it's not just a nice hymn that I like you to sing every week because I like it, although it is one of my favourites. Ask anyone in the choir, they'll tell you all the hymns are my favourites. But it represents God's real action in the world on a level that I can't even explain. It represents God's action in the world realised in us and lived through this community. And that's what Ida's baptism is too. God's action in the world calling her into baptism so that she then is living through this community into something bigger than herself. That's nice. like sushi after school, hey?